fire. Since Prometheus first brought fire to mankind, energy has been at the heart of all our development and our activity. Everything that mankind has tried to do has been dependent upon having energy. If you go back to earliest times, think of what was going on in those caves that some of the Greens would like us to live in once again. They were cooking food. It was fire that allowed us to store food, to eat differently, to have literally extra blood for our brains that grew bigger. The development of our nature is dependent upon cheap energy. And this has been true throughout all history. It's how the Industrial Revolution takes place. Why does it take place in England, in the United Kingdom? It takes place partly because we've changed our form of energy. We've cut down all our woodland. Even at the Battle of Trafalgar, the ships made for Nelson and his fleet were built with wood that had been imported because we'd cut our wood down. We therefore needed new means of energy, and we developed extraction of coal. And that gave us the energy to allow the Industrial Revolution to take place. It gave us the higher calorific value that was required for industrial processes. And then you get the development with oil and, of course, the motor car and aviation, and so many of the exciting developments that have led to civilization have meant that the standard of living for all of us is so much better than it was for those who were the contemporaries of Neanderthal man. That has been the policy choice of governments forever until about 30 years ago, when people decided that what was coming out of this fire, the smoke, the carbon dioxide, was so wicked, was so dangerous, was so noxious, that we must have less energy, and it must be made more expensive, and it must be harder to come by. And if you look at the consequences of that, you see that the countries that have been most rigorous about implementing the Paris Accords, the attempts to get to net zero, they're the ones whose economies have performed the worst. And that's basically the European economies, including, I'm sorry to say, the United Kingdom. The countries that have ignored it, China, India, and to some extent the United States, the United States is in a mid position, have done much, much better. Cheap energy drives economic growth. Now you know all of that, and you know what we've been doing has undermined economic growth. Jobs have been transported abroad in heavy industry because we've made our energy so much more expensive, and we're going to find that we fall behind in AI because computing requires lots of energy too, and we have the most expensive industrial electricity in the world. So, why do I now think that net zero is on the way out? Why do I think that its death knell has been sounded? Well, I think two things have come to the fore in the last few days. The first is the really important statement by Bill Gates. Bill Gates has been one of the high priests of the climate change concern, hysteria, if you prefer. He's used his money, his influence, his success to tell people that it's urgent and that if we don't do something about it, we're all doomed. He was very much one of the believers in the destruction of humanity if we didn't cut our emissions now. And finally, he's changed his mind. He's come round to Nigel Lawson's position, really sensible position in my view, the one that I fully support. But you shouldn't try and stop emissions. You should simply ameliorate the consequences, as we all do, because actually that's the great success of man, is to deal with the harsh conditions of the world and make them habitable, so that man can live everywhere on this planet, not because the climate has been changed, but because of our adaptability. Very interesting, as an aside, to see that there is an attempt to climb Everest using the equipment that was available at the beginning of the 20th century. And that shows, just in that simple, narrow context, how developments in the last 100 years have made it so much easier for people to do things. Why? Because we've adapted, because we've used technology, we've used modern materials to make it possible to do things we couldn't before. If you look at New York, the advent of air conditioning has made New York a much pleasanter place to live in during the summer, and indeed deaths from heat stroke in New York have collapsed It used to be a problem at the beginning of the 20th century. That is the adaptability that Bill Gates is now talking about. It's using human ingenuity to make conditions livable rather than thinking that you can change the conditions. It's actually, as it happens, much more realistic than thinking that you can change the climate, which I've always thought was a vain prospect. The other thing that's happened that is important is COP30 in Brazil, because COP30 has been an utter waste of time. Have you even noticed it was going on? I've discussed it on GB News a couple of times, but only to say that it's pointless. 50,000 people flying there, emitting lots of hot air, both through their mouths and through their aeroplanes. But the big players, not there. Where's the President of the United States? Where's the Prime Minister of India? Where's the President of China? They're at home because they don't think this grand talking shop is worth their while. That what initially excited people with COP was that net zero was a reality, and now instead it is fading from the public consciousness because political leaders, whether democratic or not, recognize that their people, their voters or those they lead, require cheap energy to be prosperous, and all politicians at all times in the whole of history have always wanted to keep their populations happy, contented, and it doesn't matter whether they are monarchs or oligarchs, corrupt or honest, democratic or totalitarian. They always want to make sure that the population they lead is happy and is getting steadily more prosperous, and that means cheap energy. It doesn't mean net zero. And now we have one of the richest men in the world saying that there's a way that you can deal with it that means we're not all doomed. It's really very good news. Of course, Keir Starmer doesn't believe this. He says he's still committed to net zero and all of it, but it won't happen. I'll make a prediction that net zero for 2050 will not happen in the United Kingdom. We will not ban cars, petrol and diesel cars, in 2030. We will stop subsidising renewables in the way that we are because we simply can't afford it. The policy is on the cusp of changing. And even this Labour government will find, as they found with gas boilers that they were going to phase out and now they're not, even with Ed Miliband, they are going to row back from the positions they have taken. Net zero is dying. Bill Gates will be one of the pallbearers, but possibly Donald Trump will be the lead pallbearer as he carries its coffin to bury it 6 feet under. As always, thank you very much for listening. Hope you'll join me again soon.